When I first met Mark, he was everything I thought I ever wanted in a man. He was kind, or maybe he only acted like he was kind. He was gentle, or maybe he just knew how to look that way when people were watching. We met in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone. He worked at the auto repair shop my dad trusted for years. And when I walked in that day with my broken car, he looked at me and smiled like I was someone he had been waiting for. At that time, I was 26 and just starting to believe maybe love could happen for me too. I had worked hard all my life in a small bakery and spent most of my days covered in flour. Mark used to come by early in the morning saying he wanted coffee, but really it was to see me. For months I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. He made me laugh, he made me feel seen, and when he proposed, I said yes with tears in my eyes. The first few years of our marriage were simple. We lived in a small rented house with a garden that I tried to fill with flowers. He promised we would build our future together. But then small things began to change. He stopped looking at me when I talked. He started staying late at work. He stopped holding my hand when we walked down the street. I told myself every marriage goes through rough patches, but deep inside I could feel something breaking. I started noticing perfume on his shirt that wasn't mine. Once I found a lipstick stain on his collar, and when I asked, he laughed, saying maybe one of the ladies at the shop hugged him. I wanted to believe him, because believing lies was easier than accepting my heart was being betrayed. One evening I baked his favorite apple pie, hoping to bring us closer again. He didn't even take a bite. He just looked at his phone, smiling quietly like there was someone else on the other side of the screen. That night I cried silently while he snored beside me. Something inside me whispered enough. I didn't know what courage meant until I found proof. One afternoon, I went to drop off lunch at his shop. His truck wasn't there. One of his coworkers said he left early to meet a client, but my heart told me something different. I drove around until I saw his truck parked outside a motel at the edge of town. For a moment, I couldn't move. I sat in my car, shaking, feeling like the world had stopped spinning. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just watched as he came out holding another woman's hand. She looked young, carefree, and unaware of the woman sitting just a few yards away whose heart had just been ripped apart. I didn't confront him that day. Instead, I went home quietly that night when he came back and said he had been working overtime. I smiled and nodded. But something inside me had changed. It was the day I stopped being his naive, loving wife and started becoming a woman who knew her worth. For weeks, I thought about what to do. Should I leave him? Should I expose him? Should I fight for what was left? And then I remembered my mother's words. She used to say, honey, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. That sentence gave me peace. It didn't make the pain go away, but it reminded me I still had control of my choices. I didn't swap anything or plan anything. Cruel like the women in movies, what I did instead was braver. I quietly packed my things while he slept. I left a note on the table that said, I hope one day you understand what you lost. Then I walked out into the night with only my car keys and a suitcase full of clothes. Driving away from that house was the hardest thing I ever did. Every mile felt like a goodbye to the life I once dreamed of. I cried so much that I had to pull over on the side of the road, but even through the tears, I felt something new, freedom. I moved into a small apartment near the lake. At first, I couldn't sleep. I missed the sound of his voice, even though I hated him. I missed the routine, even though it had been empty. But slowly, the silence started feeling peaceful instead of lonely. I began baking again for myself, this time not for him. I found a part-time job at a local cafe and met people who reminded me the world was still kind. One day, an older woman named Ellen came to the cafe every morning, and we started talking. She had been through the same pain years ago. She told me something I'll never forget. She said, sweetheart, forgiveness doesn't mean you let them back in. It means you stop letting them live rent-free in your heart. Those words changed me, so I forgave him silently, not for his sake, but for mine. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need closure from him. I just needed peace. And when that peace finally came, I realized I was braver than I ever thought I could be. Months later, he tried to come back. He stood outside my new apartment crying, saying he made a mistake. But by then I had learned that sometimes strength means walking away and never looking back. I looked at him one last time and said, "Mark, you taught me what love isn't, and for that I thank you." Then I closed the door gently and felt the weight lift from my shoulders. That was the day I truly became free, not from him, but from the version of myself that accepted less than she deserved. The weeks after I closed that door were strange. Some mornings I woke up and forgot I was alone. Other mornings I woke up and felt a deep calm, like I had done something right for the first time in years. It was not easy. Healing never is. But I started to notice small things again. The way sunlight touched my kitchen counter, the sound of birds outside my window, the smell of coffee brewing in the morning. It felt like life was slowly whispering, "Welcome back." I decided to make my apartment feel like home. I painted the walls soft yellow and placed fresh flowers on the table every Sunday. It became my ritual. Each flower reminded me I could bloom again, even after being cut down. I found a small second-hand bookshelf and filled it with novels about women who found their strength after heartbreak. Every story felt like a piece of my own heart being stitched back together. One afternoon, while working at the cafe, Ellen introduced me to her niece Rachel. Rachel was around my age, cheerful and talkative with a spark that reminded me of who I used to be. We became fast friends. She invited me to small gatherings where people laughed and shared stories about their lives. At first I felt out of place, but little by little I started to laugh again too. It felt strange how joy could find its way back even after everything. One night Rachel told me she admired me for leaving when I did. She said, "Not many people have the courage to walk away from a life that looks perfect on the outside but feels broken inside." Her words made me tear up because for so long I thought leaving made me weak. That night I realized it made me strong. Months passed and I began to dream again. Not about love, not yet, but about purpose. I wanted to help women who felt trapped the way I once did. I started volunteering at a local community center that offered support for women going through hard times. At first I just helped with organizing donations or baking for small fundraisers. But soon they asked me to speak at one of their gatherings. The thought terrified me. My voice used to tremble even when ordering coffee. How could I stand in front of strangers and talk about my pain? Ellen told me, "Just tell your truth the way you told it to me," so I did. I stood there that day, my hands shaking, my voice soft but steady. I told them how I once believed love meant enduring everything, even disrespect, how I confused loyalty with losing myself, and how I learned that courage isn't about fighting someone else. It's about choosing yourself. When I finished, there was silence for a moment and then quiet clapping that grew louder. I saw tears in the eyes of women who had been holding their stories inside for too long. That moment changed me. After that day, they asked me to come back every month. Each time I spoke, it felt easier, lighter, like I was letting go of a piece of the past. I realized my story wasn't something to hide, it was something to share. If even one woman could find her strength through my words, then everything I had endured had meaning. One evening after a talk, a young woman came to me, her eyes red from crying. She said, "I listened to you tonight and I finally decided to leave the man who's been hurting me for years." I hugged her tightly and whispered, "You are not alone." That night when I got home, I cried again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. For the first time, I felt like the pain I had lived through had turned into something good. I started baking again seriously this time. I made cupcakes and pies for charity events. Soon, people started asking to order them, and that's how my small home business began. I called it Sweet Courage Bakery because every bite had a story behind it. I wanted people to taste hope and strength in what I made. Before I knew it, I was working full-time again, not for survival, but for joy. One morning, I got a message from Mark. He wrote that he had seen my bakery online and that he was proud of me. For a moment, old feelings rushed back, the memories, the pain, the betrayal, but then I smiled softly because his words no longer had power over me. I didn't reply. Some stories don't need an ending, some just need peace. Years later, I met someone new. His name was Daniel. He wasn't charming or flashy, but he was kind in the quiet ways that matter. He listened when I spoke. He cared about my dreams, and most of all, he respected my scars. He once told me, "You've been through the fire, and you still smell like flowers." That line made me laugh and cry at the same time. I didn't rush into love this time. I let it come softly like morning light. And when he proposed, I didn't say yes right away. I took time to think because I had learned that love should never be chosen out of fear of being alone, but out of peace in being understood. When I finally said yes, it was not because I needed him, but because I wanted him to walk beside me. Now when I look back, I don't see betrayal anymore. I see a woman who broke but rebuilt herself. I see a woman who turned her heartbreak into hope for others. And I see a life that bloomed from ashes. When Daniel and I got married, it wasn't a grand wedding. We stood by the lake with a few close friends and a sky that glowed soft pink. Ellen was there smiling proudly like a mother. Rachel brought flowers from her garden and said, "These blooms remind me of you because they never stop growing, no matter how hard the weather gets." I laughed and hugged her tightly. That day I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes when your heart finally forgives the past. Daniel looked at me and said, "I know life hasn't been easy for you, but I promise you this, I will never be the reason for your tears." His words touched a place in me that had been afraid to believe again. Our life together was simple but full of warmth. We cooked dinner together and took long walks by the lake. Some nights we sat in silence holding hands, and it was enough. I had finally learned that love wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady like a heartbeat. But life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. One morning I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Mark's sister. She said he had been in an accident and was asking to see me. For a moment I froze. The name that once made my heart ache now felt like a shadow from another lifetime. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to say no. Another part of me whispered, "Maybe this is your chance to close the last door still open." Daniel found me sitting quietly on the porch, staring at the lake. When I told him what happened, he didn't try to stop me or tell me what to do. He simply said, "Do what your heart needs to be free." Those words gave me the courage to face the past one last time. The next day I drove to the hospital. Walking down those sterile hallways, I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't seen Mark in almost 5 years. When I entered his room, he looked older and weaker. His eyes widened when he saw me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "You came." I nodded. He said, "I don't deserve your kindness after everything I did." I told him, "I'm not here because you deserve it. I'm here because I needed peace." He began to cry softly and said, "I ruined the best thing I ever had." I said, "Maybe you did, but we both learned something. Pain teaches, and sometimes that's the only way we grow." We talked for a while about the past, the mistakes, the regrets. Then I told him I forgave him a long time ago. He looked at me like he couldn't believe it. He said, "Why would you forgive me?" And I said, "Because holding anger would only keep me tied to what broke me. Forgiveness isn't saying what you did was okay. It's saying I won't carry it anymore." When I left his room, I felt lighter than ever before. Outside the hospital, I stood in the sunlight and whispered, "Thank you, God, for helping me let go." I realized courage wasn't only in leaving him, it was also in forgiving him. That night I came home and Daniel hugged me without asking what happened. He just held me close until my heartbeat slowed. I looked up at him and said, "I finally feel free." He smiled and said, "You always were, you just needed to remember it." Years passed and life continued to unfold in quiet, beautiful ways. Sweet Courage Bakery grew into a small shop by the lake. Every wall was filled with pictures of women who had rebuilt their lives. Each one had their own story of heartbreak and healing. Some of them called me Mama Courage, and it made me laugh every time. Sometimes I still thought about that girl who once cried on the side of the road. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that one day she would bake again, smile again, love again, that her scars would not be ugly but proof of survival. On my 50th birthday, Rachel and Ellen organized a small gathering at the bakery. There was laughter, music, and a cake shaped like a heart with golden cracks drawn across it. Rachel said, "Those cracks represent your journey because you didn't hide them, you turned them into art." I couldn't hold back my tears. I looked around the room filled with women who had become my sisters through shared pain and shared courage. I said, "Sometimes life breaks us so we can rebuild stronger. Sometimes it takes losing everything to finally find ourselves." As the evening ended, I stood outside the bakery watching the sunset reflect on the lake. The sky glowed with colors of gold and pink. I thought about all the chapters of my life, The love that hurt, the pain that taught, the peace that followed. And I realized something beautiful. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, I will try again tomorrow. I smiled softly, feeling the breeze against my face, and whispered to myself, I made it. Not perfectly, not easily, but I made it. And maybe that's what real bravery looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep living and loving even after being broken. Sometimes I think courage doesn't begin in the moment we stand up to someone. It begins much earlier, when we are still small and learning what love and pain feel like for the first time. I grew up in a tiny town outside Columbus where winters were long and summers smelled like cut grass and apple pie. My mother raised me and my two brothers all by herself after my father left when I was 9. I remember the night he left, there was thunder outside and my mother was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a letter. Her hands were shaking but her eyes were steady. I asked her, Mama, is Daddy coming back? And she just said, sometimes people go where they think they will find peace, and sometimes that peace isn't with us. That night, she tucked me into bed and said something I never forgot. She said, sweetheart, the world may try to break you one day, but don't ever let it take away your kindness. That was the first time I heard her voice tremble. I didn't understand it then, but I carried those words with me my whole life. My mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and sewing clothes at night. I used to sit beside her while she stitched old fabric into something new. She would smile and say, look how even torn things can be made beautiful again. That became my favorite thought in the world. Maybe that's why years later, when my marriage broke, I didn't lose hope completely, because somewhere inside me, her voice was still whispering, you can sew your life back together. When I was 16, I got my first job at the local bakery. The owner, Mrs. Grant, was a kind old lady with silver hair who believed everyone needed a purpose. She taught me to bake with patience and love. She said, baking is like life. You can't rush it and you can't fake it. I loved how she trusted me with small tasks at first and then with bigger ones. It was in that little bakery that I learned what hard work and pride felt like. It was also where I met Mark years later, but that's another chapter. Back then I dreamed of opening my own shop someday, one that smelled like cinnamon and safety. But life took me down a different path. Still, every time I needed dough or waited for bread to rise, I felt close to my mother. She had passed away before she could see me grow up, but I always felt she was somewhere nearby, guiding me quietly. There were days when money was tight and I skipped lunches so my brothers could eat. But I never complained. My mother's strength was like a shield over us. She never spoke badly about my father. She just said, we cannot choose what others do, but we can choose what we become because of it. Those words became my compass later when I faced betrayal myself. Sometimes when people see me now, they say, you're so strong, you make it look easy. But they don't know the nights I cried into my pillow at 15, wondering why my father didn't want us. They don't know the mornings I went to school, pretending I was fine while my shoes had holes and my notebooks were secondhand. Strength doesn't come from what's easy. It comes from surviving what should have broken you. As I built my new life after leaving Mark, I began to remember more of my mother's lessons, like how she used to say, when you help someone else heal, you heal yourself too. That thought became the heart of Sweet Courage Bakery. Every time a woman came in crying over her pain, I saw a reflection of my younger self watching her mother stitch something broken into something beautiful. One day, a girl named Emily started working at the bakery. She was quiet and shy, always looking down when she talked. After a few weeks, I noticed bruises on her arms. She said she fell, but I recognized that kind of silence. I didn't push her. I just gave her space and kindness. One evening, she stayed after closing and finally told me about her boyfriend who hurt her every time he drank. I held her hands and said, Emily, you are stronger than you think. She cried for a long time. I told her the same words my mother told me. Sometimes people go where they think they will find peace, but sometimes that peace isn't with you. She left him a few weeks later and started rebuilding her life. Watching her grow reminded me that pain doesn't have to end your story. It can start a new one. There were nights when I sat by the window thinking about my mother. I wished I could tell her that her little girl had finally become the woman she wanted her to be. Kind even after being hurt, strong even when scared, and brave enough to love again. I imagined he are smiling somewhere, saying, I told you, sweetheart, you could make torn things beautiful again. Sometimes I visit the small graveyard where she rests. I bring her fresh flowers from my garden and sit quietly telling her about my life, about Daniel, about the bakery, about the women I've helped. I always end by whispering, "Thank you, Mama, for teaching me that real courage is soft. It doesn't shout, it simply stands tall." Even in the storm, when I drive back home afterward, I feel calm, like everything I went through had a reason. Because if I hadn't lived that pain, I wouldn't be able to help others find their strength. And maybe that's the real gift of surviving. You become the light you once needed. Sweet Courage Bakery became more than a business. It became a small, safe place for hearts that had been broken but still wanted to heal. People came not only for the cupcakes and pies, but for the peace they felt inside those walls. The smell of cinnamon, sugar, and hope seemed to mix in the air. Every morning I unlocked the door before sunrise. The quiet hours before the world woke up were my favorite. I would knead the dough and whisper small prayers for the women who would walk through that door that day. Sometimes they came with stories that sounded just like mine. Sometimes they came not to talk at all, but just to sit with a cup of coffee and breathe. Either way, I welcomed them with the same smile and the same warmth my mother once gave me. One of the first women who became a regular was Lisa. She was in her 40s with tired eyes but a soft voice. She always ordered the same thing, a blueberry muffin and black coffee. For weeks she never spoke much. Then one morning she said quietly, "You remind me of someone who never gives up." I smiled and asked her who. She said, "The woman I used to be." That was the first time she opened up. She told me her husband had left her after 20 years for a younger woman. She said she felt invisible, like her best years were gone. I told her that invisible things still have light. We just forget to see it sometimes. She started volunteering at the bakery soon after that. Now she handles orders and greets customers with the same smile she once thought she had lost. Every time I see her laugh, I feel proud because I know she found herself again. Then there was Naomi. She came in one rainy afternoon, soaked and shivering. She said she had nowhere to go. She was pregnant and had left an abusive home the night before. I gave her a towel and a warm pastry and told her she could rest in the back room. She stayed for a few weeks helping me bake and clean. Slowly her eyes stopped looking scared. When her baby girl was born, I was there holding her hand. She named the baby Hope because she said that was the first thing she found here. I still keep a picture of them on the bakery wall. Whenever I look at it, I remember that small acts of kindness can save entire lives. The bakery kept growing quietly like a flower garden. People started calling it a healing place. Sometimes I laughed when they said that because I never planned it that way. All I did was open the door and let kindness do the rest. We started something new called Heart Evenings every Friday. Women came together after closing time to share stories over tea and homemade cookies. Some cried, some laughed, and some just listened. No one was judged. The first night only 5 women came. A year later there were 20 every week. It became like family. We didn't talk about perfection. We talked about survival. We didn't talk about bitterness. We talked about healing. I watched strangers become sisters through shared pain. One evening, a young girl named Hannah spoke for the first time. She said she had always hated herself because her father left when she was small. She thought it was her fault. I told her about my own father and how long it took me to stop blaming myself. I said sometimes people leave not because we are not enough, but because they are lost inside themselves. She started crying and said those were the words she had needed her whole life. Moments like that reminded me why this bakery existed. One day a local journalist visited the bakery to write a story about women-led businesses. She asked me what made Sweet Courage special. I told her it's not the cakes or the pies, it's the people. She smiled and said, "You know what this place feels like? It feels like forgiveness baked into bread." That line stayed with me. Forgiveness baked into bread. Maybe that was exactly what it was. After that article came out, more women started coming, not for food, but for strength. We began small workshops teaching skills like baking and budgeting. We helped women start small home businesses of their own. Lisa taught classes in customer care. Naomi handled supply lists while caring for baby Hope. The place buzzed with laughter and the smell of vanilla. It was like watching light spread from one candle to another. One afternoon, Daniel came to pick me up from the bakery. He stood quietly at the doorway, watching me talk to the women. Later he said, "You know, you built something bigger than a bakery. You built a community." I smiled and said I didn't build it alone. I just opened the door. He kissed my forehead and said, sometimes that's all the world needs, someone brave enough to open a door. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the women whose lives had touched mine. Each one had come in with pain and left with hope. I realized maybe that was my purpose all along, not to erase pain, but to help others walk through it. I remembered my mother's words, torn things can be made beautiful again, and smiled, because I could see it happening every day around me. Now, every time I bake, I whisper small prayers into the dough, for the lonely ones, for the ones learning to forgive, for the ones still afraid to start over. I tell them in my heart, you will be okay. You will bloom again. You just don't know it yet. And somehow, I think they hear it, because every woman who walks into Sweet Courage Bakery leaves with a little more light than she came with. It had been almost 10 years since the day I first opened Sweet Courage Bakery. The walls had seen tears and laughter and everything in between. I often told people that this place had a heartbeat of its own, but even hearts that shine with kindness sometimes tremble when life changes again. Daniel had started feeling tired a few months back. At first he said it was just stress or maybe too much work. But then one morning he fainted while carrying flour bags into the truck. I ran to him screaming his name. The doctor said his heart was weak and he would need surgery soon. I remember sitting in that hospital hallway, holding his hand and whispering, please stay with me. He smiled faintly and said, don't cry, my love. You taught so many women how to be strong. Now let me borrow some of that strength. I wanted to be brave for him, but the fear felt heavy. Every corner of the bakery reminded me of him. The counter where he'd written silly notes, the old stool where he sat every evening waiting for me to close. He had been my quiet anchor, and I couldn't imagine life without his calm voice telling me everything would be all right. The night before his surgery, I couldn't sleep. I sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand and watching the monitors beep. He opened his eyes and said softly, remember what you told that girl Hannah, about people who leave because they are lost, not because we are not enough. If I have to leave, promise me you'll remember that too. I broke down crying, but he just smiled like he always did. He said, life is like bread. It rises and falls and still feeds someone's soul. I whispered, please come back to me. And he said, I'll try my best. The surgery took 6 long hours. Every minute felt like an ocean of worry. When the doctor finally came out, I could tell by his eyes that it had been close. Daniel made it through, but his recovery was slow. He couldn't help at the bakery anymore and had to rest most days, so I started managing everything on my own again. There were moments when I felt like giving up, but then I'd hear his voice in my head saying, open the door, just one more day. And I did. Every single morning. Months passed. And slowly Daniel started sitting in the bakery again. He'd watch the women work, laugh, and learn. Sometimes he'd tell customers stories about our first years together, how we built this place with almost nothing. He said this bakery saved me twice, once when I lost myself and again when I found love. People smiled when he said that, but I could see how much truth was hidden behind those words. Then one winter morning, the snow outside was falling soft and slow. Daniel was sitting by the window with a blanket around his shoulders. He called me over and said, I want to tell you something. When I go, promise me you'll keep doing this, keep helping people, because every loaf you bake, every cup you pour, every hug you give is a piece of heaven on earth. I told him not to talk like that, but he just smiled again. He said, you were always the brave. Not me. That was the last real conversation we had. He passed away 2 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep, with my hand in his. For days I couldn't enter the bakery. The silence felt heavier than any grief I had ever known. The women came to visit, bringing flowers, food, and long hugs. They said he was part of their story too. One by one, they told me how his kindness had touched them. Lisa said he once fixed her broken car when she couldn't afford a mechanic. Naomi said he built a crib for baby Hope from leftover wood. I realized then that Daniel's kindness had lived quietly in small moments, and that it would keep living through all of us. A few weeks later, I unlocked the bakery door again. The smell of sugar butter and memories filled the air. I stood behind the counter and whispered, this is for you, Daniel. That day, customers poured in as if the town itself wanted to remind me that I wasn't alone. A little girl pointed at the picture of Daniel on the wall and said, is he the man who made the sweet roast taste like happiness? I nodded through my tears and said, yes, baby, he is. Over time, the pain softened. It never disappeared, but it began to glow instead of burn. I started something new called Daniel's Day every year on his birthday. On that day, the bakery gives away free bread to anyone who needs it, no questions asked. The women volunteer, the town gathers, and laughter fills the air. We tell stories about kindness and courage and love. Every year I bake one special loaf and keep it by the window. I tell people it's for him. But deep down I know it's for all of us who have ever lost someone and kept going anyway. Now, when I sit by the same window where Daniel once sat, I look at the snow and smile. I think about all the people who walked through that bakery door broken and left whole again. I think about how life keeps moving in circles of giving and healing. And I whisper softly to the air, I'm still opening the door, Daniel, just like you asked, because courage isn't loud or perfect. Sometimes it's just waking up, making coffee, unlocking a door, and choosing kindness one more day. And maybe that's what real strength is. Not revenge, not anger, not fear, just love that refuses to give up. The end. Thanks for watching. If you like my story, so please like, comments, and subscribe my channel.